According to regional authorities, the situation in eastern Ukraine dramatically escalated on the evening of December 3rd. Russian fighter aircraft struck the city of Soloyan in the Jit region and dropped a total of 9 precision-guided bombs, one of which directly hit a multi-story residential building. According to Ladim Filkin, head of the military administration of Jit, at least 8 civilians were injured, while rescue forces continue searching under the rubble for further victims. In parallel, emergency teams from Kharkiv, the second-largest city of Ukraine, reported at least 1 additional fatality after ongoing Russian air attacks that have damaged several apartment blocks. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian General Staff published new figures that illustrate the scale of the nighttime attacks. According to these, Russia carried out 52 airstrikes within a few hours, used a ballistic missile, and fired 153 guided bombs at various targets. Additionally, 3,787 artillery attacks as well as 50 multiple rocket launches were registered. This massive wave of air and artillery operations has led to severe destruction in several regions, including a large-scale power outage that affects tens of thousands of households. While the search operations in Soloyan continue under difficult conditions, observers are asking whether this latest escalation is a sign of a new phase of the conflict, a phase in which urban targets could once again come under intensified fire. Welcome to our channel. As the fighting in eastern Ukraine has intensified for weeks, a pattern is increasingly coming into focus for international observers. Russia is intensifying its attacks on densely populated urban areas and increasingly using precision-guided bombs that possess significant destructive power. The attack on the residential building in Soloyan is therefore not considered an isolated event, but part of a broader strategy aimed at placing massive pressure on Ukrainian infrastructure and the civilian population. At the same time, the situation in several regions is worsening, due to the ongoing attacks on energy facilities, which leave tens of thousands of households repeatedly without electricity. Experts point out that this combination of military pressure and sustained destruction of vital supply systems could have significant long-term effects on the country's stability. Against this backdrop, the question is gaining importance of how the Ukrainian armed forces and the international community will respond to the increasing intensity of Russian airstrikes. Will the latest escalation lead to expanded support for Ukraine? Or does the increase in precision-guided bombardments indicate that Russia is strategically realigning its warfare for the winter? On the evening of December 3rd, a series of Russian attacks began that struck several regions of Ukraine simultaneously and whose effects were still felt hours later. In Soloyan, a location in the Jit region, 9 precision-guided bombs dropped by fighter aircraft caused extensive destruction. One of the bombs directly hit a multi-story residential building whose facade collapsed and severely damaged numerous apartments. Rescue forces reported that at least 8 civilians were injured, while they continued searching under the rubble for additional affected individuals. In parallel, Ukrainian authorities in Kharkiv, the hometown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, reported several injuries as a result of new missile attacks. 5 people were taken to the hospital after Russian missiles struck residential areas. In Kharkiv, the second-largest city of the country, at least 1 additional civilian was fatally injured. Emergency forces found the body of a victim under collapsed structural components while the search for further trapped individuals continued. Shortly afterward, the Ukrainian General Staff published detailed figures that illustrated the scale of the attacks. 52 airstrikes, 1 ballistic missile, 153 guided bombs, and 3,787 artillery attacks were registered within 1 day. Additionally, 50 multiple rocket launches and the use of more than 4,400 unmanned aerial vehicles were reported. Energy infrastructure also once again came under fire. Several regions experienced large-scale power outages that affected tens of thousands of households and further complicated the work of rescue services. Material damage occurred at Naftogaz facilities, while drone and missile attacks in 4 additional regions caused more victims. Authorities warned that the combination of destroyed residential buildings, ongoing fires, and failures of critical supply systems is making the situation increasingly dangerous for the civilian population. The renewed series of large-scale attacks on Ukrainian cities stands within a longer context that has continuously intensified since the beginning of the war in February 2022. Already in previous winter periods, Russia had deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities, heating systems, and residential complexes. The goal of this approach was to increase pressure on the civilian population, while simultaneously restricting the operational capability of Ukrainian authorities and armed forces. The attack on the multi-story building in Soloyan fits seamlessly into this pattern, as precision-guided bombs are increasingly being used to hit both military and civilian targets. Another central component of the current escalation is Russia's intensified use of high-explosive guided bombs, which have been a defining element of its air offensive for months. Observers point out that these weapons, in combination with drone attacks and artillery strikes, pose significant challenges for Ukrainian air defense. The latest statistics, including 153 guided bombs in a single day, illustrate the intensity of this tactic. In parallel, Russia has long relied on the systematic weakening of Ukraine's energy supply. The recent attacks, which have cut more than 17,500 households in Kharkiv and thousands more in Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, off from electricity, are reminiscent of the events of the winter of 2022, when repeated missile attacks caused nationwide outages. At that time, millions of people were left without heating and electricity for days, which triggered international concern. An important counterweight is Ukraine's ability to hit critical Russian systems despite heavy attacks. A recently released recording of the destruction of an R-330Z jamming system shows that Ukrainian units remain capable of eliminating valuable enemy equipment. This system, used by Russia since the early 2010s, plays a central role in disrupting communication networks, including satellite links. According to reports, around 23 of these mobile jamming stations have already been destroyed since the beginning of the war, which is considered a serious loss for the Russian armed forces. The fact that Ukraine continues to locate and destroy such systems underlines the dynamic development of the conflict. While Russia intensifies its attacks and increasingly relies on guided bombs, Ukraine attempts to undermine the enemy's electronic superiority through targeted strikes. The combination of growing destruction of civilian infrastructure and the ongoing struggle for control over key technological resources shows how profoundly the character of the war has changed over time. The recent attacks illustrate that Russia is increasingly basing its air operations on a combination of different weapon systems, with precision-guided bombs playing a central role. These bombs, which are dropped by fighter aircraft from medium altitudes, are equipped with guidance units that correct their flight path and thereby enable high accuracy. In urban areas such as Soloyan, this leads to particularly severe damage, as the detonations not only destroy the buildings hit, but also shake surrounding structures and significantly hinder rescue operations. The high number of 153 guided bombs used in just one day confirms that these weapons have become a core instrument of Russian airstrikes. In parallel, Russia is intensifying its use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which are used not only for reconnaissance but also for direct attacks. With more than 4,400 UAV deployments registered within a single day, a complex threat situation is emerging. UAVs can detect the movements of Ukrainian units, overload air defense systems, and mark targets that are subsequently struck with bombs or missiles. This multi-layered attack tactic makes the work of Ukrainian air defense significantly more difficult, as various threats must be countered simultaneously. Of central importance is also Russia's use of electronic warfare. Systems such as the destroyed R-330Z are intended to disrupt Ukraine's communication channels, including satellite connections and tactical radio networks. Successful interference can severely impair the responsiveness of the Ukrainian armed forces, as coordination and data transmission become slower or less reliable. However, the fact that such a system could be located and destroyed shows that Ukraine continues to find ways to break through Russia's electronic superiority. On the Ukrainian side, adaptation and modernization of air defense play a decisive role. The integration of Western systems, the use of mobile launch units, and the increasing experience in intercepting drones have helped mitigate certain attacks. Nevertheless, the challenge remains enormous, especially when multiple attack waves occur simultaneously. The recent damage to energy facilities illustrates that critical infrastructure continues to be particularly vulnerable. Overall, the analysis shows that the war is increasingly shaped by technological factors. Precision-guided bombs, electronic jamming systems, and drone-based target acquisition define the dynamics of the fighting. Ukraine's ability to respond flexibly to these threats will be decisive in the coming months in determining whether further urban centers can be protected from similar attacks. The recent escalation of Russian attacks has triggered a clear reaction from the international community, particularly from countries that have supported Ukraine militarily and financially since the beginning of the conflict. Australia announced on December 4th a new aid package worth 95 million Australian dollars, which includes both modern military equipment and material from its own defense forces. According to Defense Minister Richard Marles, 50 million Australian dollars are to be used for military equipment that is provided on NATO's recommendation for urgent Ukrainian needs. Another 43 million are allocated to tactical air defense radars, ammunition, and technical equipment that come directly from the inventories of the Australian Armed Forces. In addition, $2 million will be invested in an international drone initiative that is intended to supply Ukraine with advanced UAV technology. New Zealand has also expanded its support and approved a new military aid package worth 15 million New Zealand dollars. The government stated that the funds are to be used to acquire military equipment that meets NATO recommendations. With this step, New Zealand's total support has risen to more than $110 million since the beginning of the war. Both countries therefore count among the first non-NATO states that provide targeted financial resources enabling Ukraine to access modern military equipment. Clear signals also came from Canada. The Foreign Ministry announced that an additional $235 million would flow into NATO's trust fund for Ukraine. These funds are intended to finance medical supplies, personal protective equipment, communication tools, logistical support, and training programs. Since 2022, Canada's total support has amounted to nearly $22 billion, of which $6.5 billion are allocated to military aid. The diplomatic reactions show that Russia's recent attacks are being perceived as part of a broad-based escalation strategy that makes intensified international support necessary. Observers emphasize that the combination of massive airstrikes, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, and the increasing use of precision weapons has significantly heightened concern within Western states. Several European governments also expressed concern about the ongoing attacks on Ukraine's energy supply, viewing them as an attempt to systematically undermine the country's resilience. This assessment plays a central role in current discussions within NATO that aim to further strengthen Ukraine's air defense capabilities. In view of the recent intensification of Russian air attacks, several possible scenarios are emerging for the coming weeks and months. In the worst case, Russia could further escalate its strategy and expand the use of precision-guided bombs, particularly against urban centers that are considered strategically sensitive. Such a development would not only increase the number of civilian casualties, but also massively intensify the pressure on Ukraine's energy and transportation infrastructure. If the Russian air offensive continues at this scale, Ukrainian authorities would have to expect further power outages that could affect millions of people, especially during the winter months when supply conditions are already critical. A second scenario involves a worsening of military confrontation along the front lines. The combination of drone reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and precision-guided bombs could enable Russia to act more precisely against Ukrainian positions. This would force the Ukrainian army to stretch its defensive structures even further and allocate additional resources to air defense. However, Ukraine's ability to eliminate critical Russian systems such as the R-330Z could help reduce the effectiveness of Russian attacks in the long term. A third scenario concerns the international level. Should Western states further expand their support, additional air defense systems, ammunition, and technologies for drone defense could improve Ukraine's ability to prevent or mitigate future attacks. The recent aid packages from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada suggest that such a development is already emerging. Nevertheless, it remains unclear whether the deliveries will arrive quickly enough and whether they will be sufficient to withstand the pace of the Russian escalation. Lastly, there is the risk that the continued shelling of civilian infrastructure could significantly worsen the humanitarian situation. Large parts of the population could remain without electricity, heating, or water supply for extended periods, which would be life-threatening, especially in winter. International aid organizations are already warning of shortages should the attacks continue and further energy facilities be damaged. Overall, it is becoming clear that the coming weeks will be decisive for how the conflict develops. Will Russia further intensify its air offensive? Will Ukraine receive sufficient support to protect its cities? Or is the war heading toward a new phase in which the destruction of urban areas will move even more into the foreground? The events of the past days once again illustrate how vulnerable Ukrainian cities remain to the ongoing Russian air offensive. The deliberate dropping of precision-guided bombs on densely populated residential areas, as in the case of the multi-story building in Saloyan, shows the increasing brutality of the attacks and the growing challenges for rescue forces, the civilian population, and state authorities. At the same time, the massive power outages that extend across several regions reveal how profoundly the attacks affect the daily supply situation of the people. While Ukraine continues attempting to neutralize the enemy's electronic advantages through the destruction of Russian systems such as the R-330Z, the pressure on the country remains high. The international community is responding with intensified military and financial support, but it remains unclear whether these measures will be sufficient to prevent the next level of escalation. The recent aid packages from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada send a strong political signal, but their actual effectiveness will depend largely on the speed of delivery and the adaptability of the Ukrainian armed forces. In this tense situation, the question of how the conflict will develop in the coming months is becoming increasingly urgent. Will Ukraine succeed in better protecting its urban centers and mitigating the consequences of the Russian attacks? Or does the increase in precision-guided bombardments indicate that Russia intends to further intensify its strategy? We will continue to closely monitor developments. If you want to stay informed about the latest events surrounding the conflict, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, and share this video to support the discussion.